What if weakness wasn't innocent? What if it distorted not just the self, but society itself? These unsettling questions lie at the heart of Friedrich Nietzsche's provocative critique of morality. Far from offering comfort or easy answers, Nietzsche challenges the deepest assumptions of Western thought, especially those concerning virtue, compassion, and human worth. A 19th-century German philosopher, Nietzsche is renowned for his fierce criticisms of religion, particularly Christianity, and of moral systems that he believed prioritized the weak at the expense of human excellence. Through works such as On the Genealogy of Morality and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche launched an unrelenting attack on the values he saw as life-denying, values that, in his view, stifled strength, creativity, and the will to power. Nietzsche's hatred of weakness wasn't rooted in cruelty or a desire to dominate others. Instead, it stemmed from a deeper concern: the belief that weakness disguises itself as virtue, breeds resentment against the strong, manipulates others through pity, and slowly corrodes the vitality of both individuals and culture. For Nietzsche, true flourishing demands a confrontation with these false values and a bold reimagining of what it means to be strong. In this sense, his critique is not a rejection of compassion outright, but a warning about the hidden dangers that arise when weakness is elevated as a moral ideal. Weakness as dishonesty with oneself. Friedrich Nietzsche challenged the traditional understanding of weakness. For him, it was not merely a lack of physical power or courage. It was, more fundamentally, a refusal to face the truth. Weakness, in Nietzsche's view, was often masked as virtue, humility, or even kindness, but at its core, it represented an inner betrayal, dishonesty with oneself. This kind of weakness begins with the avoidance of personal flaws. When individuals cannot bear to confront their limitations, contradictions, or darker impulses, they construct illusions to protect themselves. These illusions become the scaffolding of a false self, a curated identity that avoids discomfort but also blocks growth. The result is self-deception, an intentional blindness that distorts one's entire worldview. By refusing to see ourselves clearly, we also lose the ability to see others and the world as they truly are. This distortion has consequences that reach far beyond the self. Authentic action becomes impossible because our motivations are clouded by denial and rationalization. Judgment becomes unreliable, swayed by what feels safe rather than what is true. And perhaps most dangerously, trust, both in oneself and in others, breaks down. When you lie to yourself, how can you trust your own decisions? When others sense this inauthenticity, how can they trust you? Nietzsche saw this internal dishonesty as a rot at the foundation of modern moral values. He believed that many moral systems were built not on strength or clarity, but on weakness masquerading as goodness. People convinced themselves they were virtuous because they renounced ambition, power, or desire, not out of strength, but because they feared what they might discover if they pursued them. So, what happens when we protect ourselves from truth instead of confronting it? We become estranged from our own potential. We live behind masks, afraid to look in the mirror, building lives on comfortable lies. Nietzsche's challenge is clear and unsettling. True strength requires brutal honesty, especially with oneself. Only by facing our flaws, instincts, and contradictions head-on can we begin to live authentically. Weakness, then, is not in failing. It's in refusing to see. The birth of resentment. Resentment is a reaction to personal failure, When people can't act, they hate those who can. At the root of resentment lies weakness, not just physical or social weakness, but a deeper kind, the inability to effect change or assert one's will in the world. Those who feel powerless often look at the powerful with envy, but rarely admit it, even to themselves. To do so would require an honest confrontation with their own inadequacy, a painful and humbling act. Instead, they invent a moral justification for their bitterness. This is the psychological sleight of hand through which resentment is born. Rather than striving to improve themselves or emulate strength, the weak redefine values. They twist the meanings of good and evil to suit their position, creating what Nietzsche called a moral inversion. Strength, ambition, and excellence, once considered admirable, become synonymous with arrogance, cruelty, or selfishness. Meanwhile, weakness, humility, and passivity are exalted as virtues. The person who cannot climb the mountain declares that the peak is wicked and the valley is sacred. This isn't a conscious conspiracy, it's a defense mechanism. The resentful person doesn't admit, "I hate him because he's better." Instead, they say, "He's corrupt and I'm moral." It's not enough to feel powerless. The ego demands a story in which that powerlessness is noble. Consider the figure of the morally superior person who constantly critiques others under the guise of virtue. On the surface, they seem principled and selfless, but beneath lies a deep bitterness. Their virtue is not the product of discipline or inner strength, but of resignation. They can't win the game, so they claim the game is evil. Their criticism of the powerful isn't driven by justice, but by jealousy. True morality is not born of resentment, but of strength. The ability to act, to choose restraint when destruction is possible, to uplift rather than tear down. But the resentful person doesn't see it this way. They cling to a version of morality that justifies their weakness and disguises their hate. In this way, resentment is not only a personal failure, it becomes a cultural virus. It spreads through ideologies that punish excellence and glorify victimhood, all while calling it compassion. What begins as envy becomes a worldview, and what begins as bitterness becomes a moral crusade. Pity as manipulation. Friedrich Nietzsche offers a sharp critique of pity, especially when it is used not as a sincere expression of compassion, but as a tool of manipulation. In his view, not all pity is virtuous. Some forms actively undermine strength, autonomy, and personal growth. This manipulation occurs when individuals exploit the natural human impulse to care for others, weaponizing their suffering to gain attention, avoid responsibility, or extract emotional labor from those around them. One key way this manipulation operates is by encouraging others to offer sympathy instead of solutions. Rather than seeking genuine help or improvement, the manipulative sufferer fixates on their pain in a way that demands perpetual consolation. The goal is not healing, but control, eliciting ongoing emotional investment from others without requiring change. This kind of pity hijacks empathy, turning it into a means of self-preservation and influence. Guilt-tripping is another tactic. The sufferer subtly suggests that others are morally obligated to support them, often indefinitely. The implicit message is, "If you don't care for me, you are heartless." This form of emotional coercion traps the compassionate person in a cycle of service, where their kindness is not freely given, but extracted under duress. Nietzsche saw this dynamic as a corruption of morality, where weakness masquerades as virtue and manipulates strength into servitude. What emerges is a form of false virtue. Pity becomes a substitute for personal development. The sufferer remains stuck in their condition, shielded from the hard work of growth, while the helper assumes a role that flatters their ego, but ultimately serves no higher purpose. Both parties are ensnared in a cycle that Nietzsche would call life-denying. It inhibits vitality, strength, and the will to overcome. Nietzsche's challenge to us is clear. True compassion must be empowering, not enabling. It must recognize suffering, but not enshrine it. Real care involves helping others rise, not just feel momentarily comforted. Compassion, when properly directed, should lead to strength, independence, and resilience. Anything less becomes a subtle form of control, cloaked in kindness, but rooted in fear, guilt, and stagnation. In sum, Nietzsche warns against pity that paralyzes rather than uplifts. He invites us to be wary of emotional manipulation disguised as moral duty, and to reimagine compassion as a force that restores agency, not robs it. The disorganized will weakness equals lack of inner order for Nietzsche. True strength lies not in brute force, but in the clarity and unity of one's will. A strong individual possesses coherence between desire, thought, and action, a harmony in which decisions arise from a focused, integrated self. By contrast, the weak will is fragmented, pulled in opposing directions by impulses, fears, and the craving for external validation. It lacks internal order, making genuine autonomy impossible. The disorganized will manifests in chronic indecision. A person may feel an impulse to act, but hesitate due to fear of failure or social disapproval. They may desire greatness, yet cling to comfort. This inner civil war leads to paralysis. Nietzsche saw such fragmentation as characteristic of the last man, who prefers safety and conformity over the struggle of self-overcoming. The disordered will avoids responsibility, making the individual a slave, not to any master, but to their own chaotic instincts. This chaos squanders energy. Instead of channeling power toward a purpose, the weak will disperses it in conflicting directions. One moment is driven by ambition, the next by self-doubt. The result is regret, exhaustion, and a life marked more by reaction than creation. Nietzsche regarded this as a spiritual sickness. Modern individuals torn between inherited values and instinctual drives, with no unifying force to resolve the tension. The metaphor of the cracked mirror captures this vividly. Just as a shattered mirror cannot reflect a clear image, a fragmented will cannot yield clear action or self-understanding. The image is distorted, split across shards. No unified vision, no firm path forward. The person with a disorganized will loses sight of themselves. Their identity is scattered across competing roles, desires, and fears. To overcome this weakness, Nietzsche calls for the cultivation of a higher self, a being who imposes form upon their chaos. This involves choosing values, affirming them fully, and aligning one's desires and actions accordingly. Only through such self-discipline can one forge a powerful will, capable not only of decision, but of transformation. The strong will is not rigid, but ordered, not impulsive, but intentional. It reflects a self that is whole, resolved, and capable of bearing its destiny. The comfortable prison weakness as lifestyle. In the modern age, weakness has ceased to be merely a momentary lapse or a personal challenge. It has quietly transformed into a way of life for many. This new mode of existence, built on choosing comfort over clarity, fosters a dangerous illusion that safety lies in never being tested. We construct cocoons of softness around ourselves, convincing each other that fragility is virtue, that discomfort is harm, and that growth is oppressive if it asks too much. It begins subtly, with a preference for illusion over risk. A man may know his job is unfulfilling, his relationship stagnant, or his habits self-destructive. But if confronting these truths threatens to shake his comfort, he will often retreat into denial. The same applies collectively. Societies now prefer curated realities over hard truths. Slogans replace substance. Echo chambers replace dialogue. To avoid conflict, we lie to each other. To avoid growth, we lie to ourselves. The mechanism of this avoidance is cunning. It wears a face of compassion while quietly lowering the standards of excellence. We surround ourselves with people who tell us we're doing our best, even when we're not. We label mediocrity as authenticity. We cradle excuses like treasures. Pity becomes a shield against challenge, and in that shield, we hide from the work required to become more. This isn't just an individual problem. It's a societal mirror. In an effort to avoid offending anyone, we've begun to enable weakness rather than challenge it. Institutions praise passivity. Social structures reward the appearance of victimhood more than the pursuit of strength. The result is a culture that fears the discomfort of self-confrontation more than the decay of stagnation. And so we must ask, not in cynicism, but in honest suspense: have we built a world where growth is feared more than failure? Because if we have, then the comfortable prison is no longer invisible. It's become home. The UberMench, Nietzsche's answer to weakness. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the UberMench, or overman, stands at the core of his answer to the problem of human weakness. In a world where traditional morality often promotes conformity, submission, and the denial of individual will, Nietzsche proposes a radical alternative: a person who transcends these inherited limitations by creating their own values. The UberMensch is not merely a stronger person. They are a fundamentally different kind of being. One who lives beyond fear, beyond the need for approval, and beyond the inherited morality of religion and social convention. At the heart of the UberMensch is radical self-honesty. This figure does not hide behind comforting illusions or seek scapegoats for their suffering. Instead, they confront reality directly, accepting life as it is, not as it should be. Nietzsche saw self-pity and resentment, what he called ressentiment, as corrosive forces. These are the weapons of the weak, of those who cannot act, and so instead condemn action itself. The UberMensch rejects this posture entirely. Rather than blaming others or the world, they take full responsibility for their existence. Achieving this level of existence demands a disciplined, organized will. The UberMensch is not a creature of impulse, but of commitment to their own truth, their own path, and their own vision of life. This requires courage. The courage to stand alone, to challenge inherited norms, and to shape meaning in a world where none is given in advance. It is not about dominating others, but about mastering the self. Nietzsche's vision is often misunderstood as a celebration of brute strength or cruelty. In fact, his notion of strength is deeply tied to authenticity. True strength, for Nietzsche, is the ability to affirm life. Not just the beautiful and pleasurable parts, but also the painful, chaotic, and tragic dimensions. The UberMensch does not flinch in the face of suffering. Instead, they say yes to it, embracing life in its totality. This affirmation is the ultimate act of power and freedom. In contrast to the reactive morality of resentment, which defines itself against others and seeks to limit their power, the UberMensch is a creator. They do not simply reject the old, they bring forth the new. Through their values, actions, and example, they inspire a new vision of humanity. For Nietzsche, this is the only answer to the decline of traditional values and the looming nihilism of modernity. Not despair, but creation. Not weakness, but affirmation. Not obedience, but the will to become more than what we are. Nietzsche's final challenge. Nietzsche's final challenge is not a call to brute strength, but to radical honesty. Weakness, as he saw it, rarely appears as failure or fragility. It often hides in our habits, emotions, and even in the values we claim as virtuous. Compassion, humility, tradition. These may comfort us, but Nietzsche warns they can also serve as disguises for fear, resentment, or the refusal to grow. Strength begins not in domination, but in self-confrontation. Are we avoiding hard truths about ourselves and the world around us? Do we confuse routine for meaning or comfort for power? Nietzsche's philosophy demands more than intellectual agreement. It demands transformation. His challenge is deeply personal, to question not only society's illusions, but our own, to examine our beliefs, motives, and actions with merciless clarity. True strength, for Nietzsche, is forged in this fire. It is the courage to say, "This is who I am, and this is what the world is," without excuse, without illusion, and without pity. Not to escape pain, but to integrate it. Not to be accepted, but to become worthy of oneself. His final challenge remains: face the truth. That is where strength begins. And from that, a new kind of freedom, terrifying, liberating, and wholly your own.